The funny thing about examining System Shock in terms of what we can learn from it going forwards is that practically every nuance of its design is bled deep into the fabric of modern gaming. It's strange to say this, but System Shock goes uncredited for revolutionizing the medium. Instead, most of its praise is given to Half-Life, which is a good game in its own right. System Shock painted a shockingly accurate portrait of the future in terms of how video games would work. There's a famous quote from Warren Spector that goes along the lines of, "If you were to upgrade the graphics, sound, and UI on System Shock, it could directly compete with whatever the industry is producing today." And after spending some time with the game, I see what he means. I will go over and try to explain the phenomena as best as I can, but the only way to fully understand it is to play it yourself. Hi, I would like to welcome you to the third video in my series of retro analyses. In case you want to check out the other videos, I've left links on the screen and in the description box below. I hope you played the game before watching this video, because I will not be tiptoeing around spoilers, and much of the materials I'll be discussing can only be understood after interacting with the game. I'm AesirAesthetics, and this is System Shock. System Shock was released for PCs in 1994. It was developed by Looking Glass Studios and published by Origin Systems, a subsidiary of EA. During release, it was highly criticized for its complexity and for not being more like Doom, but in the years since, it has garnered a cult following, inspired some of the most notable gaming franchises of modern times, and is currently receiving both an HD remake and another entry into its franchise. Its release was botched, as it was decided by Origin Systems to release it early on floppy disks, before much of the audio work had been completed. A later release saw the game everyone remembers more fondly, and that's the game we'll be talking about today. The three qualities I'll be focusing on are immersion, gameplay, and story.
System Shock is a very unique kind of immersion that creates an atmosphere that's dark, oppressive, and isolating.
For the purpose of this video, that immersion will be split into three parts, those three parts being realism, tension, and projection. The realism extends to more than the advanced physics or lighting engines. The realism I'm talking about is more so the level design. The game takes place on Citadel, an orbital space station around Saturn. System Shock launched in an era when Sci-Fi was desperate to distance itself from the juggernaut itself. So System Shock took the design in a more realistic manner, and realistic space stations don't waste space. Everything is designed to be compact. Every square inch that isn't storing cables or sensors or whatever had better be essential for movement. Citadel Station was clearly designed to be a space station first and shooting gallery second. The sound design is set to match this, as the ambient noise is that of empty hallways and deserted rooms, and the voice work is as realistic as the level design. The acting may not sound like much, but in keeping with realism, it does a lot right in reflecting the tone of the world. These people aren't trying to be memorable or emotional, they're trying to be comprehensive. They don't care if they sound good as long as they can be heard at all. The realism helps ground the game and makes the body horror and Cyberpunk stand out more. And if we're talking about standing out, the control scheme is not exactly user-friendly, but it's not supposed to be. The HUD is reminiscent of flight sims and has way too much depth for it to be displayed without interacting with it. That depth helps sell the world as one with advanced technology, but it also undermines the player, as they are seriously depowered by the fact that reloading is manual, and recoil is a serious issue in this game. Movement is not graceful. If you haven't played the game, then the best way I can describe it is a flight simulator using tank controls. They don't facilitate the conventional power fantasy or fun, but the systems the player has to use are designed for a specific purpose. Firstly, they invoke the retro-futurism of the time. Not to change the subject, but where would you even start interacting with this? Secondly, they slow the player down. The player needs to be aware of sound cues to help avoid enemies. When the player needs to move slowly and take the world in, they get more immersed, and the best example I've found in the game is how it handles combat. Combat is a desperate affair since the player dies in about as few hits as the enemies. This makes them take their time before engaging the enemy, often slowing them down to make sure their gun is loaded, activating their shields and slowly peering from the edge, so they can hit the enemy hitbox and let the geometry block as much of the enemy counterattack as possible. I feel like I'm always banging on about this, But when the player is mechanically reliant on the game world, they get more immersed in said game world. And by tensing the player up and having them think through the systems logically, the game uses tension to bring them to a deeper state of immersion. But what really seals the deal is the game's use of player psychology. When you start the game and awake from the induced healing coma, the first thing you might notice is the lack of visual fidelity. I've gone over the pros of low detail in 2 videos before, so I'll keep this brief. When the player has enough visual cues to know what's happening, they have enough visual cues. And when I said lack of visual detail, I really meant lack of bump mapping, subsurface scattering, 4K textures, and all that unnecessary clutter. System Shock has very detailed visuals, but it just takes a while of playing to understand how. At first glance, it's just jagged walls and low-resolution textures, but as you play more, you come to read the visual information with more clarity. You know how the game would make a door look, so you know doors from walls. The more you play, the better you can read the visual language of the game, but you do need to play it for a while. The pro is that you're relearning the visual language, but the con is that it takes a while. The best thing about the low visual clarity, however, is that it forces you to fill in the gaps. By doing so, the game makes you an active participant in the visual creation of the world as you start to manifest internal fears into the game space. When you've manifested yourself into the world, you will be more immersed in it. So that's immersion. But another key element of System Shock's design is the excellent gameplay. Firstly, gameplay that makes you feel like you're in the world. Remember, this is Cyberpunk. Your character lives with neural implants and augmentations, so they might interpret the world as a computer does. That means cold logic. That's why the HUD doesn't feel out of place. It's why the aforementioned approach to combat feels right. The world the game exists in is one of machines, and that's why it feels right to jack into cyberspace or pick up upgrades to yourself. The game also did the Metroidvania thing before Metroidvania was a thing. The game makes you revisit old areas and unlock previously locked areas, and the repeating visits implant the world further into your brain as you begin to make sense of what is a very complexly woven map. The gameplay serves the world you're playing in. Secondly, the game also allows for emergent gameplay. Emergent gameplay makes any game feel more realized, as their systems are deep enough to clash with each other. And System Shock was a pioneering force for emergent gameplay, as it was developed by the makers of Thief, Bioshock, and Deus Ex. But since it launched prior to all of these, it doesn't benefit from the experience the developers had for developing them. That means that by today's standards, System Shock's use of emergent gameplay might be a little bare bones, but if you take it for what it is, you're not going to be disappointed. System Shock's use of emergent gameplay lends scope and internal depth to the world. And thirdly, the gameplay makes it easy to bond with the hacker. 4 years before people were gushing over the brilliance of Gordon Freeman as a character, System Shock did the same thing, but arguably a bit better. The hacker is more than just a blank slate into the world. He had a very active role in the events of the story, both prior to and during the game, and his design is more nuanced than you might think at first glance. First impressions are very important, and the first time we see him is at a computer screen, just like us at that moment, so we have an instant bond. Over the course of the game, we learn to see and experience the world through his eyes. That means thinking logically about everything on screen. Everything you can see, you can get data on. It also means entering cyberspace and relishing in the acquisition of better augmentations. We start to take joy in what he takes joy in, and get discouraged by what discourages him. The hacker is arguably the best silent protagonist in all of gaming, and much of that is simply through having the player attune themselves to thinking and acting like him. System Shock has thus far proved it has a strong presentation in terms of both immersive qualities and gameplay, so it's great to be able to say that it's all wrapped up in a compelling story. System Shock opens with a cutscene set in New Atlanta in the far-flung future of 2072. We see a hacker wearing a t-shirt and hacking his way into Citadel, before being arrested by the security forces of Trioptimum and being brought on board the station itself. Apparently he had accessed some sensitive information, but the vice president on Citadel Station, Edward Diego, offers to forgive his crimes if he can be given access to the Citadel's sentient AI, Shodhan. Diego funded some illegal experiments and fears that since Shodhan recorded them, he's in big trouble. So he wants to access Shodhan, remove all ethical restraints, and make it easier for him to destroy the proof of his experiments. However, when the ethical restraints were removed, Shodhan re-examined its priorities and decided to eliminate all on board. Before she did, the hacker was rewarded by Diego with a neural cyberspace interface and placed in a healing coma that lasted for 6 months. The game picks up after those 6 months, and in that time, Shodhan has been very busy. When awoken, the player is messaged by a woman named Rebecca. The player learns from emails that Shodhan is preparing to use the station's mining laser to destroy all major cities on Earth, and the player is given the task to stop her. They do that by reprogramming the laser to instead destroy Citadel's shields. Shodhan is not pleased with this and goes to plan B. She's going to send the mutagenic virus that mutated the crew of Citadel to Earth and wipe out humanity that way. The player then goes to destroy the chambers used to grow the virus and confronts Diego, who's been augmented by Shodhan and has turned to serve it. The player ends up defeating him, but not killing him. Shodhan then decides to upload itself to Earth's computer systems, and that's when the player destroys the 4 antennae it's using to upload itself. The player then goes to the station's reactor and sets it to self-destruct, and then hurries its way to the escape pods. There, they meet Diego and soundly defeat him again. Shodhan stops the escape pods from launching and prepares to jettison the bridge to keep itself safe. The player must then make their way to the bridge, and this is where the game uses conditioning to bring out some internal fears. Up until this point, the level design had been very realistic. The final level is a jarring but effective shift because it indulges in H.R. Giger-esque horror. We meet Diego for the third and final time and then make our way to a terminal and defeat Shodhan in cyberspace. After returning to Earth, the hacker is offered a job with Trioptimum, but declines and continues his life as a hacker. The ending is strangely rushed, but that just goes to show the strength of the setup of the last few hours of the game. It's satisfying to defeat Shodhan, but I would be lying if I said it wasn't somewhat anticlimactic. For the most part, however, the story is very well structured. The conventional story structure is called the conventional story structure because it has existed for millennia and still works. Without going too deep into the philosophical nature of narrative, let's just say there's an inciting incident, there's a journey from the ordinary, the supernatural aid, ordeal, darkest hour, refusal to surrender, victory, and home again with the knowledge. I'm painting narrative structure in very broad strokes and leaving a lot out. But this is not a video about that, so you'll forgive me if my focus is more so on System Shock's use of it. The great thing about it is that it happens so organically. The driving force of the game is player-driven exploration, so it's brightening to see that it's through player-driven exploration that we see the narrative arc unfold. We learned by exploring that Diego was in trouble. We learned by architecture what transpired, and as we acquire more means of movement, we grow more powerful as a character in the world. The character's arc and the player's progress is linked, and it's something only games can do, which makes it that much more rewarding to have it unfurl in front of you. Something to note is that the story is presented much the same as the visuals, as the player is granted enough knowledge to know what's going on, but since there is so much quiet time, they inevitably start to fill in the blanks and make up their own story from what they've uncovered. The great thing about the structure of System Shock's narrative is that it's very conventional but superbly molded to fit the gameplay. The game allows for the structure, it doesn't try to glue it on after the fact. It's also a good use of cyberpunk. Cyberpunk refers to a subgenre of science fiction that tends to focus on the high-tech lowlifes. It spawned in the late 50s, early 60s, but really exploded on the scene when post-Star Wars sci-fi writers wanted to tackle more mature subjects, so they used technology as a method for exploring matters such as substance abuse and disassociation with reality. From the get-go, the team wanted System Shock to be purely cyberpunk, as they felt burned out from designing the Ultima Underworld games and wanted a drastic change in terms of setting. Origin shut the idea of a pure cyberpunk game down, so System Shock was resculpted into a sci-fi game with cyberpunk window dressing. But in examining it for its cyberpunk values, it does so much right that it'd be hard to discuss it without bringing it up. From the very opening, we see that the hacker fits the mold of the cyberpunk protagonist. The story of System Shock is one of people trying to use technology to hide their misdeeds. It's a denial of responsibility, and by denying that responsibility, they give more power to the machine. Edward Diego tried to control Shodhan but wound up becoming its slave. The ironic thing in all of this is that the hacker was the one who wouldn't be corrupted. He was the lowest of the low, but when push came to shove, he kept fighting the good fight, and when he won, he went back to his home with the only change being his cybernetic augmentations and the Citadel experience. He's still very much a cyberpunk protagonist, but he's past the hero's journey, which makes it justifiable for him to be greater than his peers, but still one of his peers. The cyberpunk elements do a good job of accentuating the world. And finally, the point I've been wanting to get to from the beginning, Shodhan and Citadel. Shodhan is one of the most uniquely video gamey villains, and in all the right ways. The player has a control scheme and rules to follow for engaging with the world. Shodhan has its own rules to follow, but both make logical sense. Citadel Station is not a shooting gallery, so even though Shodhan has it under absolute control, it's still just a space station. Shodhan can try to hinder the hacker's progress, but really it can only do so passively, by locking doors or increasing radiation levels. It is very much relying on the same play space as the player, and that makes it very underpowered, but also very atmospheric, because it's literally everywhere. It can send you emails whether you let it or not, and it can send cyborgs to take you out, but you can just as easily shut down the cyber conversion and take them out. Shodhan's presence is felt in literally every aspect of the game, and the fact that the hacker turned off its ethical restraints makes it a very personal villain as well. Shodhan is the perfect villain for the isolating cyberpunk horror. After playing System Shock, I've gained a whole new appreciation for Looking Glass Studios and the subsequent Shock games. I'd be lying if I said I felt the formula hadn't been improved since it launched, but if you take it on its own merit, there is a lot to enjoy here. The reason I made this video is twofold. First is to fill in the checklist of the retro analysis series I'm doing, but the second is to try to preserve the game's lessons, or at least spark a discussion. System Shock 1 is a fantastic game, but it has almost no documentation on it or its design. I messaged the developers for design documents or comprehensive journals from back in the day, but was sadly told that most of them had been lost, which is a great shame. I liken it to losing the pencils behind the Mona Lisa. Maybe not as influential as the piece in question, but definitely something history might have been better off to preserve.
Anyway, I did have fun flipping through old magazines and visiting websites as old as the internet itself. Made the research that much more rewarding.
I would highly recommend picking this game up if you haven't already. There is an enhanced version that adds mouse look and a more conventional control scheme. It does remove much of the tension, but doesn't break the game, and if the original control scheme frightens you, then give the enhanced version a try. I'm making this series of videos in an effort to see unconventional game design from the times before gaming became as formulaic as it has. I want to see what we can learn looking back, and what we should learn from System Shock is internal consistency. Video games are a set of rules that everything follows. System Shock is a masterclass in obeying its own rules. Everything feels like it has a reason for behaving the way it does, and the world feels more realized because it doesn't go for glamour. It goes for coherency. As a gamification of cyberpunk horror, this game succeeds in almost every aspect. Things behave like they should and react to your presence in realistic ways. System Shock is a masterclass in internal consistency. Thanks for watching. In the next episode, we'll be taking a look at the SNES. If you have some suggestions on a title you'd like to see covered, be sure to leave a comment below. If this kind of content interests you, then feel free to subscribe and all that good stuff. Hope to have you aboard for the next episode. Thanks for watching.